Good afternoon. Can you all hear me? Okay, I can feel it. Yeah, I'm Ramasubramanian, Vice President for Research. It's my pleasure to welcome to this event to discuss digital technology and youth and development. Just want to be sure get this topic right. Some of the things I'm going to say, some of you have been in my 3 earlier versions, but I always try to add something new specific to the topic. Hopefully, there's something new for you to listen to. So, as you all know, we are the university is executing the Great and Good 2030 plan with 5 focus areas, and we have been systematically investing in those 5 areas, and we have done 3 of the 5 so far. And this year we're doing the digital technology and society and precision health. And this topic fits under the digital technology and society. We are focused on building our research capacity in these areas, and that's our primary goal of the investment through grant challenges. We charged faculty steering committees to determine how best to focus our efforts. They consulted with the deans and faculty across grounds, and this is part of the consultation process, to identify areas of research where UVA could build on its strengths and address urgent societal problems. The primary purpose is not to directly fund research. In other words, it's not a problem that we want to solve, and here are the resources, let's go solve it. But instead, build capacity across the board, including maybe the infrastructure that you need, the team gaps in teams that you need to build, postdoctoral support, student support that you need so that you have a team when you propose to a funding agency, for example. You are very competitive. There's no gaps in terms of the resources and the capability, capacity of the team doing the work. And then you've already thought through the topic through these discussions, so there's been sufficient work that's gone in. So that's sort of the idea. The topic for this discussion is, again, an interdisciplinary topic. It has many aspects to it. Depending on the way you look at this topic, there is an input to be made. A couple of days ago, there was a New York Times article by David Leonhardt. I'm not sure how many of you might have read this, called "The Phone in the Room," and which essentially framed the conversation, today's conversation, nicely. So I'm going to observe how what you're discussing connects and where the strengths are. The author starts off with teenagers spending about half their waking hours on their smartphones. Half. That shocked me, 1/2. But when I looked at I track my iPhone, usage time. Sometimes it's 3 hours, 40 minutes. I mean, I said, wow, So half doesn't initially shocked me, but then if you have the time, waking time, that's a lot. There are issues with that. They use their phone when they are alone and when they're with their friends. So that's another observation. And the author notes that this is a 15-year-old phenomenon and has profound impact on the mental health, social skills, and most importantly on their sleep, which some other authors call it an epidemic. So if you have not read it, I would recommend it. It was just a nice article in New York Times just 2 days ago. So do we blame technology? How can we use technology for positive benefits in youth and development, and finding ways to mitigating negative effects? So that's sort of what crystallized when I read that article. Then that led to a link. I'm kind of junky when it comes to reading these articles. I go to a link, and then that opens up a book, and I read that, and that says, go read this. And this is a book by Lisa Damour. You know her book on the emotional lives of teenagers. That's gripping account of essentially discussing the topic of raising connected, capable, and compassionate teenagers, and she offers strategies for safely introducing technology to the young. How do you introduce technology? And initially, she basically says that don't blame the teenagers. They did not invent the technology. We did. So it's our responsibility to see how we introduce that technology to them in the positive ways and monitor the use and so on. So that's sort of my preparation for coming to this meeting so I can understand what you all are saying. We have expertise in this room on this topic from different points of view. and starting from technology to psychology to education to public policy. That's the beauty of UVA, where you have prominent folks. And bringing them together, we have already done half the job. It's just putting you all in one room does it. Then giving you resources and arm yourself with the ammunition you need, I can't imagine what you can all do. So I know that after the discussions, crystallizing on topics that would make sense and to advance this topic and coming up with topics to work on would be wonderful. And we have also talked about our School of Data Science, the advancements in the industry in the maturation of AI, and we have added significant GPU power to compute large-scale computations, AI, ML computations at UVA, and will only continue to grow. And when you have all of those, when you have lots of data and you conduct longitudinal studies, et cetera, and data exploration at very large scale become possible. So as experts, you're going to be discussing your strengths, and then offer ideas across disciplines, and then we develop transdisciplinary ideas on this topic. So I'm looking forward to understanding and learning from you about this topic, and looking forward to the outcome of all these deliberations in the form of a white paper and a concise version that will come up soon. So with that, I want to thank you for your participation today, and I want to introduce Megan Barnett to say her words of welcome.
All right, I know everyone is very concerned now about Justin Bieber's health news. So Rom can compete with Justin Bieber, but I'm not sure I can. So first of all, Provost Balcom wanted to be here today. He had planned to be here, but as you may know, the BOV starts tomorrow, the Board of Visitors meeting, and some people were in town early, and there need to be some, as you can imagine, a few pre-meetings. So he's not able to be here today, but he asked me to pass on some messages and thank yous. So one is he wanted to thank Shelley Lovelace and Dolores Roberts and Cindy Orange for all of their help shepherding the steering committee and planning this event and helping put it on today. So thank you all. He wanted to thank the steering committee, who you'll be hearing more from over the course of the afternoon. And he especially wanted to thank all of you for giving up your afternoon, which looks like is going to be in nice weather, so thank you very much. And for contributing your ideas and creativity to this effort. It's exciting to see people from so many schools and disciplines here today, because we know that we have many experts in these topics, so more than we could fit in an afternoon of panels. So we are really anxious to hear your ideas and your suggestions on what we should be doing in grand challenges in this area. But even beyond grand challenges, we really see this as an opportunity to help build and support the research community around these topics, because these are important topics. They are not going away, and they're things that we need to focus on as a university. So we really appreciate all of you being here today. We've built in time, the steering committee has built in time for small group discussions, and also there is a reception afterwards where we hope people will continue the conversations. And I hope that over the course of today, you might have a chance to meet someone who you haven't met before, whose research intersects with yours or complements yours. And if there's anything we can do to help support those connections, please let us know. Include that with your feedback. So thank you all, and I'm going to turn it over now to Bethany Teachman, the chair of the steering committee.
A huge thank you to Megan and Ram for bringing us all together today for the opportunity to have this conversation. On behalf of the steering committee, I want to welcome you. We really appreciate you taking the time to be here this afternoon, and I'm really excited to learn from you and share ideas. I also want to add my thanks to Cindy Orange, Shelley Lovelace, and Dolores Roberts, who've just done a phenomenal job bringing together 4 events in a really rapid space of time. So huge appreciation. And my thanks to the steering committee, both for the work that they have done already and the work that's to come for us over the next month as we try to synthesize all of these amazing ideas to put forward the white paper. Why are we here? I think Ram and I are both a little disturbed by the news headlines that are out there at this time. And I will also add, I am raising 2 teenage daughters, so I have a special stake in this right now. But, last night I just went on Google News and I, put in youth and health, and look what came up yesterday. And this, and this, and this. This is all in the last 24 hours. I could show you headlines just from the last 24 hours that would take all 3 hours of our time here to talk about the scope of this problem, the extent that we are dealing with, a crisis. Now, I am a clinical psychologist, so I focus this kind of in mental health, but that's not the only domain that we could focus on. As we look at some of these challenges that we're facing with youth development, we're facing many different challenges in this space. And of course, technology is often pointed to as one of the challenges of, is it fair to blame social media for teenagers' mental health? Teens are turning to TikTok in order to get their diagnoses. How much screen time is too much, right? I saw the phone article that you referred to as well. And I think that these are really important questions that are being asked, but I also think this narrative is too narrow, right? It's framing it in terms of, let's talk about the ways that technology is causing all of these problems. And it's definitely a glass half empty perspective. And it's an important part of the perspective, but really an incomplete conversation. And so our steering committee has really been thinking about, in line with the sort of charge we were given, how can we think about shifting that narrative? Yes, these are important questions for us to be asking, but we also want to flip it around. We want to ask, how is it that we can use digital technology to foster healthy development? There's an enormous role to play as we think about increasing access to services, access to care, increasing reach, increasing different ways of promoting learning. And of course, we want to think about this from multiple angles. So we're going to focus today on 3 broad areas with full acknowledgement that those areas are not truly, totally divided, right? Those are somewhat artificially created. So we're going to talk a lot about health, and then we'll have Lee's going to give us a good discussion in the health area to talk about in what ways we can use technology to foster healthy physical, mental, and behavioral health. We're going to talk about education, and Scott's going to set the stage for how we can think about the ways that technology can help promote healthy learning and development at different stages through the learning lifespan. And then we're going to talk about culture and civic life, and we'll hear from Ashley and the ways that she's been thinking about how do we kind of set the stage to understand how technology can help people to engage more fully, to be full participants in civic life and in their communities. And as I said, we know that this is not really, sort of a single, that these are not sort of truly separate categories. And in fact, many of you do work, and I would place myself in this category, that really could go across a bunch of these different areas. So I picked, I'm going to spend 30 seconds on one project that I'm doing in collaboration with Laura Barnes and our team, Mehdi Bukechba, Alex Wernz, and Wolf, that shows the way that we actually move across areas here. So we do work trying to understand when people experience anxiety and how we can bring digital technology solutions to help them reduce that anxiety in the locations where they are, to help them kind of when and where they need it most. This is a new app we're testing. It's called Mind Trails Teen, and it's particularly focused on teens who are experiencing anxiety and distress. Now, it sounds like that's pretty health-placed, and it is in a lot of ways. I think of myself as, a clinical psychologist. I work in the health field. But we're doing it in the context of mentorship programs. So we know that, for example, youth who are in Big Brothers, Big Sisters programs are really, really underserved in terms of their mental health needs, despite having really high rates of anxiety and other challenges in that space. So if we want to actually deliver a program like this, we need to work with folks in education and understand, how do we actually educate the mentors in order for them to support the teens in using this program? So we're not just in health. We had to develop all kinds of training programs and educational outreach in order to reach our mentors so that they could actually effectively deliver this program. And this program, well, as soon as you start working with mentorship programs, we're talking about Big Brothers, Big Sisters, religious organizations, all of a sudden we're right embedded in civic life. We're understanding, how is it that we need to think about community partnerships? How is it that we need to understand how we can use these technologies to better support people's engagement, to better support people's access to services? And I highlight that just to show you that we're going to talk across these different areas. We are using this really for heuristic purposes more than anything else. The other thing that we want to highlight as we set the stage for our conversation today is, of course, that youth don't exist in a vacuum, right? So this was another of the headlines that I pulled up last night. U.S. teens feel down. The adults aren't doing so well either, right? And we know that we want to understand really key developmental processes rather than a particular biological age. And so the key sort of period is going to depend on the question that we're asking. So we want to think about how can we use digital technology to foster healthy development in the areas of health, education, culture, and civic life across the developmental, with a lifespan perspective. Because when we think about, for example, when I think about development of anxiety problems in my area, I'm thinking a lot about late teen, early 20s period. You're going to hear from Jessie Gibson today, who works in the area of neurodegenerative movement disorders. The developmental critical period where technology can help is a little bit different. You're going to hear from folks in education who may be working at younger ages and thinking about how can we promote learning, how can we promote reading skills, whatever it happens to be. That might be a younger period. So we don't want to think about it as just, here's the one age that matters. What we want to think about is this question of how do we support critical, healthy developmental periods to get people through these transitions, to get people through these growth opportunities in ways that allow them to actually thrive. And what I hope you'll feel at the end of our afternoon today is that this is an incredibly exciting time and an incredibly exciting place to be having these conversations. It's an exciting time for many reasons. It is a different national landscape now, partly as a result of COVID, but also as a result of many other national pressures that has opened up opportunities for people to have conversations like this and openness to the roles of digital technology. It's also, I think, an exciting time because of some of the technical advances that you'll hear about that allow more people to access these services, for us to think about scaling the models that we're going to be talking about in different ways than we could previously. So the potential there is absolutely enormous, and this is a really unique, special time to be thinking about how to make progress in this area. And I think, you will have no doubt at the end of the afternoon that this is an exciting place to have this conversation. We were overwhelmed as our steering committee started to do the work of looking at who's doing interesting work in this space. I mean, the floodgates opened. It's an amazing place in terms of things that are happening. And for me, what has been an absolute pleasure is I didn't know too many of you prior to having these conversations. And it's been an absolute delight. We've been holding office hours, virtual office hours, where we've had a number of people come. I didn't even know about the Biocomplexity Institute and things that it did. Now I've met many people from there who are doing absolutely amazing work, and some of you are here today. And I could give countless examples of all of the amazing things that are happening across campus and the opportunities that are there. And so we're really excited to come together for these conversations. Our goal today is not to do lots of long talks where we just highlight one example and go in lots of depth. What we want to do is raise questions for you to think about and facilitate a conversation where we learn from you. So I'm showing you in advance the questions that you're going to be prompted with during your breakout group sessions, because as you watch these talks that are designed to seed these conversations, I want you to be thinking about what we're going to ask you and to start getting the ideas kind of circulating and the blood pumping. So the first question is, what would UVA need to do in order to become a national leader in advancing the use of digital technology to foster healthy development? Think about what expertise is needed. Ram gave it, we hadn't coordinated, but that was a beautiful setup of if you wanted to think about writing that grant and saying, we've got all the expertise here, who else do we need here? What are the areas that we need to cover? What are the resources that are needed in order to successfully collaborate? What are the partnerships that we need to be fostering? Whether that's partnerships on ground, with industry, with the community, with government. What infrastructure is needed to do this work effectively? And then what initiatives would you be most excited about? We're going to ask you to say, hey, we can't do everything, right? So what are the research questions tied to this topic that you're most excited about? I don't mean specifically what exact study would you run. What are the questions that you think, wouldn't it be amazing if a lot of people at UVA came together and said, let's work on this, let's think about this, and truly have impact in this area? And then the last question is sort of related and says, how would you recommend that UVA builds on its existing strengths tied to digital technology, youth, and development so that we can increase our impact in a way that supports sustained growth and leadership? This shouldn't be a 5-year thing, right? We want to be setting this up in order to be successful in the long run. And how is it that we're going to do that so we have those opportunities? So with that, let's dive in. I don't want to take more of the time. Hopefully you have an agenda in front of you. Thank you to all who have agreed to speak and share their expertise today. I also want to thank all of the people who submitted introduction slides but aren't necessarily going to have a chance to come up and talk to you today. We were thrilled and overwhelmed by the response, and as I said, there is an amazing amount of expertise here. We're going to, during the breakout sessions, be running through the range of slides that we receive so that you can get exposure and see the range of ideas that people were putting out there, and we'll make sure that people are getting that information. We also want to note that we don't view this as the end of the conversation. So on your agendas, you have sort of the QR code in order to keep reaching out. We hope to keep hearing from you as we continue this conversation. And with that, what I'd like to do is invite up our education presenters. So I'll invite Scott to come up, as well as I believe it's Jamie, Jake, and Nancy if you want to come up here, and we'll turn the floor over to you. Thank you all.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Really pleased to be here today, and I appreciate Bethany's leadership and the collaboration of the other folks on the steering committee and trying to think broadly about how we could best use this time. So I'm going to move fairly quickly, and as Bethany indicated, not really talk too much about very specific exemplars and applications, but more try to map a conceptual space of the different ways that technology is relevant to youth education. And I'm talking primarily from a youth development point of view, but obviously most of what I'm saying would be relevant across the lifespan in different ways. First, I wanted to kind of give a sense of how I would define education for today's purposes, especially in the context of the other topics on health and civic life. I think it's useful to think of education in terms of both academic learning that most of us would associate with schools in terms of cognitive and knowledge processes that are part of the academic subject matter of education. But I think very importantly, schools historically and increasingly today under this broader rubric of social emotional learning are concerned with helping students develop a range of competencies that are associated with understanding and managing emotions and behavior, and doing so in the context of individual sort of dyadic relationships as well as group settings. And those are skills that are often highlighted, especially in the early years of education, but it's not too hard to sort of reflect even in our own ongoing development about how we all are struggling and striving to kind of continue to grow in these areas across our adult lives. So education really involves both of those, and obviously overlaps to a great extent with health and civic life, but for organizational purposes, we're talking about them separately today. I want to highlight 3 different ways that youth are immersed in digital technology, primarily to, as much as it's important to focus on direct interactions with technology that are sort of informal, like Ram highlighted. That's one way in which youth interact with technology and are influenced, but there are multiple ways, and they kind of lend themselves to different ways of thinking about what we might focus on. So first, youth are obviously making active choices to engage with digital technology informally outside of schools or other service systems that they may be a part of. That can happen for purely individual recreational or learning goals. So students who, youth who engage in lots of online gaming that may be individual or multiplayer, or engage and interact with new emerging learning technologies that we've been reading a lot about with great concern recently. But these technologies are emerging all the time and shifting, and how youth use or interact with those technologies individually on their own time is something that's obviously, of great concern in the aggregate, totally outside of schools and other institutional settings. They also interact with technology in ways that are directly social, and that can be with youth that they may or may not be involved in relationships in their in-person life. And so there's critical questions that are of constant challenge. In my personal area of research has been in children's relationships with peers in childhood and adolescence, and the challenge of trying to understand and track the different ways youth are engaging with social media and how that maps onto their real-world lives. Just to illustrate, some of the underlying challenges to that area of research is some of the really compelling early research on this, on the use of MySpace came out, 2 years after MySpace died. Like these things shift so rapidly. By the time people had written grants and designed studies and figured out how to measure MySpace use, it was no longer a thing. And you can imagine, as we've gone through the subsequent, it's only 15 years, how many cycles of things going in and out of use, which creates major challenges in individual investigators figuring out how to get a handle on this. So that's a constant challenge. In addition to those direct informal uses of technology, youth interact with digital technology through the service settings in which they're embedded. So service settings, like schools, increasingly deploy technology very directly and explicitly, partly historically kind of as an adjunct or partner to in-person educational services, but increasingly as pushing the limits of what can be provided primarily through technology, whether that's reading, tutoring, or social emotional learning programs. There's a whole industry that has grown up very rapidly around through either .orgs or .coms that have developed either digital curricula or games for learning, or increasingly, trying to push towards AI-driven technologies that provide students with practice and feedback on important academic and social emotional learning tasks. Those are, see, I got to my wrong page. So those things are all, the real challenge is moving from individual sort of targeted games that are really just taking existing kind of in-person curricula and putting them in some digital format, which is slow and clunky and hard to scale and is kind of limited by what curricular materials already exist, and trying to create more AI-driven, customizable, scalable solutions that can be used more broadly. That's, I think, where a lot of the current effort is trying to push. There's also ways in which technology is used it creates a challenge for supporting service systems like schools in making choices in this, enormous digital technology marketplace to figure out what are sensible, evidence-informed decisions about what districts purchase in the way of digital or curricula. So those are a couple of big things around supporting the settings. And then critically, but I think a little less obviously, technology is playing a really critical role in directly supporting the capacity of service settings and practitioners to provide maybe traditional in-person learning experiences in ways that leverage what we know. So there are a tremendous number of faculty in the School of Ed who've expressed interest in using simulation-based technologies to train pre-professional future practitioners because it provides a way to get repeated practice in an environment where they can't do any harm, and you can systematically vary the scenarios that they would experience, but it's cost prohibitive. The current approaches that have been used, at least in our school, have been mixed reality simulations with live actors who have to kind of be behind the avatars that trainees are encountering, which creates inherent problems of cost and scalability. So the real challenge is, could we leverage technologies to create simulation-based training scenarios that could be used across a wide variety of pre-professional training programs for youth, and how to go to scale with those. The other kind of way in which technology is used to support the professionals and practitioners working with youth is through what in some cases are fairly low-level uses of technology by these other standards, in the sense of using teleconferencing creatively to provide opportunities for online coaching or virtual learning communities where you can connect practitioners to relevant specialists and experts who can help support their ongoing professional development and evidence-informed practice. It's a constant challenge to figure out how to both create and sustain those communities, and what's the right structure of mutual peer support in them versus blended with new information and guidance from evidence-based, from say university-based researchers. There are examples of all of that as well in the school across a couple of projects that have been very promising, but are again difficult to figure out how to scale up. So when we think about all these things together, I just wanted to highlight that there are these multiple different ways in which technology connects out to youth development, both directly in formal use and then through the service systems, both directly and indirectly. There's a lot of strength at UVA already in areas related to this. I can speak most directly to what's at the School of Ed, where we have a lot of colleagues who are experts around processes of academic and social emotional learning, learning design and evaluation, and the current state of evidence about what works in those areas. There's a lot of infrastructure. There's experiences, as I just mentioned, with both simulation-based training and teleecho, which ironically kind of emerged from medicine, but has now been used, I think, very effectively and creatively in our educational, by some of our educational colleagues. But also, and I think critically, an infrastructure of research centers and existing partnerships with schools and state agencies that provide us with a really strong position to implement these more ambitious, sustained professional support networks. Major challenges that I think everyone will kind of connect to is how to scale up and sustain these kinds of efforts, and then how to deal with the really rapidly changing technology environment that makes it very hard for a faculty member who's not primarily expert in technology to figure out how to leverage technology. There are many, many interactions with faculty here in Ed as well as at other universities who have great ideas about a process that could really be supported by the right kind of app or the right kind of technology, but no idea on how to connect with someone whose job it would be to help them bring that to life in some pilot preliminary form. So I think figuring out how to create access to those consultation and support services to get things going is a significant challenge. With that, I'm going to stop here and leave it to our other panelists to kind of give more specific examples from their areas of work. So thank you. The first person on our list is Jamie Zoellner from the School of...
Well, good afternoon. I'm happy to be here today representing public health sciences. I was glad that you mentioned that we're not kind of all siloed, because I think I fall as closely in the health bucket as I do the medicine bucket, but we know there really are no buckets. So I'm glad that we've cleared the air on that. So I work a lot in rural medically underserved communities. I do a lot in Southwest Virginia and Appalachia and also Southside. I actually run a satellite office for our cancer center, and I'm based in Christiansburg. We've had a number of trials funded over the years and currently through NIH and PCORI. I think a lot about childhood obesity treatment, as well as childhood obesity prevention. We had a lot of nice slides about the impact that COVID has had on mental health in terms of children. The word on the street is that the past 2 decades of progress that we've made in the context of childhood obesity was undone by COVID. And so where we're seeing some stability in childhood obesity, we've now seen those rates start to climb again. So some real concerns. We've had some recent recommendations through the Academy of American Pediatrics that are recommending some real aggressive and controversial recommendations on childhood obesity treatment. That includes pharmacological treatment for kids as young as 13 and even bariatric surgery. So this is a real issue, and it's not going away anytime soon. I think there's a real opportunity as we think about the use of digital technology. How can we use digital technology in the context of childhood obesity, both treatment and prevention? I think there's a real opportunity. From my perspective, what I've seen happen in Appalachian Southside, there's lots of issues in terms of the environment. There's lots of issues in terms of access to primary care and medical providers and transportation issues. Those gaps are not narrowing nearly as fast as the gaps to digital technology. We see that these kids have technology in their hands. There's enormous opportunity. So my work specifically, we've been working in Southside Virginia on childhood obesity treatment. We partner with FQHCs, Parks and Recreation Departments, Virginia Department of Health. I also have work in Southside where we really explicitly target sugar-sweetened beverages as the primary risk factor. We see kids in this region drink about 3 cans of Mountain Dew a day, so it's kind of a low-hanging opportunity to really think about going in and interacting in terms of behavioral messaging. So I'm a little bit of a newbie in terms of using technology to solve some of these issues. I've been working with Lee and his group since I joined UVA about 6 years ago. I think we're really on to some really important and innovative strategies where we have the digital technology adult-facing, are really able to do a lot of interactive treatment using behavioral change techniques, but I think really transitioning that to be adolescent and even younger child focused scene is really an exciting area. So I think I had 2 minutes, so if that was my 2 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you, Jamie. And next we'll hear from Jake Resch, who's Associate Professor of Kinesiology in the School of Ed.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for allowing me to speak with y'all today about how we're leveraging digital technology in the Department of Kinesiology. So I'm going to zone in on my specific expertise, and I'm going to zone back out how we can leverage digital technology and physical activity. So first off, this isn't my slide.
Should just be the next one.
Nope. There. Without the beard. All right. So I study sport concussion. I work in with the University of Virginia Athletics, and we've been able to leverage digital technology to improve concussion management and learn more about concussion with our 18 to 24-year-olds. Now we're launching a multi-site study with 22 institutions across the U.S. where we're leveraging digital technology, working with our collaborators like Dr. Laura Barnes and others in order to learn more about concussion in that demographic. More recently, though, we started launching an initiative through the School of Medicine at the new Musculoskeletal Center in Ivy, where we're reaching out to the general community, the general public, for high school and middle school athletes, and leveraging technology to increase communication between the care providers that serve those athletes, but also to provide more information to the athletes and about their recovery as it relates to concussion. Now, that's my research agenda. Let me back out to the Department of Kinesiology. In kinesiology, we have experts in physical activity, and throughout the session so far, I've heard several targets that physical activity can address. Obesity, cell phone use, as I was mentioned several times, that everyone has a cell phone and they're looking at half of their day. What an excellent way to describe current levels of physical activity in young individuals, have that be a benchmark, but then intervene and use that same technology that they want to use in order to look at an intervention to improve levels of anxiety and depression, to improve the ability to reduce obesity. And also, specific to some of my colleagues in the audience, look at how digital technology can be used in order to leverage a way to predict injury, but also assist with determining recovery from injury. So when it comes to digital technology in the realm of kinesiology and specifically physical activity, I think the future is very bright. And I think we have the expertise in our department as well as across grounds in order to facilitate that as a potential way to track interventions, but also to bring in additional expertise in order to help grow the field and make us more competitive. Thank you very much.
Jake. And next we have Nancy Deutsch, who's the Associate Dean for Faculty Development and Professor and Director of the Youth-Nex Center for Positive Youth Development in the School of Ed.
All right, hello everyone. And so I'm Nancy Deutsch, and Scott, I was afraid for a moment when you were talking that you'd stolen what I was gonna say. So I was like, but I have a slightly nuanced take on it. So I'm gonna share. So first of all, my overall work focuses on taking the science of adolescent development and using it to help improve the settings in which young people grow and develop. Right, so that includes schools, but it also includes all sorts of out-of-school time programs. My own work has tended to focus on out-of-school environments, although I also do work with schools. I think a lot about how education and learning happens in both formal and informal ways, both in and out of school. And so when I think of technology, I think of it in those contexts, in that variety of contexts. So the part where I thought, Scott, that I was like, oh no, now I've got to come up with something new, but I don't think I do, was I'm thinking in particular about technology in three ways in relation to youth development. And I think they're similar to, but slightly nuanced from what Scott said. So the first is young people's own use of and engagement with technology. And that's where we hear a lot of the like, oh my God, how much are they on their phones? I will tell you, I was on grounds with my 10-year-old a couple weeks ago, and she actually looked at me and said, Mom, why do college students just look at their phones all the time? And she just, she started counting, and she was like, I have not seen a single student as we're walking across grounds who's not looking at their phone while walking. But there's also a real positive side to that, right? So for example, young people engage technology in schools to communicate with each other in ways that they couldn't have before, whether it's young people with developmental disabilities that make communication more difficult, whether it's new refugees, immigrants to this country, who now can suddenly use Google Translate to communicate with peers in the classroom, right? So there's this direct engagement with technology. And then there's technology as a tool for the adults who work with youth, right? So we know teachers are bringing technology into classrooms in all sorts of ways to support their work with young people. Scott mentioned the ways in which technology is being used to train or provide kind of on-time support for adults who are working with youth, right? So we can think of the ways in which we leverage technology to build the capacity of the adults who are working with youth across different settings. And then there's the third, which in some ways to me is the most intellectually interesting, which is the digital world as a context for learning and development. So the digital world as a context in and of itself, particularly because I study adolescence and I think about identity development a lot, that's huge, right? The digital world is a space where young people are building and constructing and exploring a sense of self, where they're also building and finding communities for better and for worse, right? They're also being recruited into communities for better and for worse. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I tend to focus on flipping the script. So you note I tend to focus on the positive because I think we focus a lot of the time on the negative and on preventing risk, and that's important. But I really like to think about how we can flip the script and focus on the positive, because I also think if we amplify the positive and support the positive, then we almost in some ways automatically reduce the negative, right? So if we can think about the ways that technology are being used by young people, for example, as tools to engage in positive identity development, in civic engagement, in the development of positive relationships, that also means they are not using it as much, right, in the negative ways that we want to avoid. And we also know that those things like engagement and positive identity development, feeling a sense of contribution, feeling a sense of belonging, that those things themselves are also protective and promotive of positive development for young people. So I think I've probably used my 2 minutes. So thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. I know we're a little bit behind schedule, so I'll make my comments a little bit briefer than I had planned to. 30 minutes just doesn't seem like an appropriate use of time at this point. And in fact, I felt like Scott did a terrific job of not only talking about education, but kind of focusing on some of the health components as well. So this domain here, we are focusing specifically on health. And one of the elements that I wanted to highlight is that health really has these three components. We're talking about physical, behavioral, and mental health. And so we want to be thinking more broadly about health across these domains. There's a lot of fantastic work that's already going on here at the university. As Bethany was talking about, we've been pleasantly surprised and enthusiastic and excited by what we've heard. These are a variety of interventions that have already been developed, some by my team, but by others as well, some that you'll hear today. Marc will talk a little bit about artificial pancreas, I'm assuming. We already heard about Jamie, although I don't think she even mentioned Kids Sip Smarter, which is a text messaging application which has had a really good run. So a lot of different kinds of interventions. All of these are health focused, some in behavioral, some in mental health. I don't want to go through too many of these, but if you see something that's of interest that you want to talk about and ask about later, be happy to do so. And finally, this slide here might look familiar because we've now used it in a number of presentations. I was pleased to see Laura gravitated towards it as well earlier today. But the variation of this time was by just pulling out a broader perspective of digital health. So oftentimes we'll talk about this as digital behavioral health or digital mental health. But just taking a broader view of digital health, there are a lot of areas that we have opportunities here at the university to excel at. We don't have expertise in all of these. There are some gaps and there are some ways that we can really improve. But having this kind of range and imagining hubs that would allow us to really be preeminent in the area of digital health. Again, a lot of stuff that's going on that's really good, that's already happening. We can accelerate that. We have opportunities to fill some gaps. But these areas are things that you might want to be thinking about when you form your small groups and talk about what are some of the things that are here and what are some of the things that are missing. Just a handful of questions. These are slight variations of the questions that Bethany already mentioned. I can't see it on here, so I'll reach over. Well, you can take a look. Hopefully these will help you think through what you want to discuss in your small groups as well, but ways of just starting to seed some ideas and seed some areas of focus during those discussions. So with that in mind, we have three presenters. I'm just going to introduce them all just very quickly by saying Becca, Marc, and Jessie are each going to talk about their areas of focus. I'll let them go one at a time so that we can kind of just move through, and we'll probably not have time for questions, but maybe do something more like Bethany was saying, where you'll have an opportunity to connect with them during small groups. Thank you. And Becca, come on up.
Lee, and hello to everyone. I'm a relatively new face around here. Oops, sorry.
No, I think I was supposed to get that, but you keep talking.
I've been here for about a year now, although only on grounds for about 6 months. So I haven't had the opportunity to meet many of you, but I'm already getting a sense of the many strengths as well as a few of the challenges that we might be able to address with this very exciting initiative. All right, great. We have my slide. So I study ways to get these health behavior interventions to populations that don't have access to them, usually using some form of technology. And my research has mostly focused on weight management, smoking cessation, and medication adherence. And if you guys are probably familiar with my experience, so I, as a researcher, get a big grant, I do a big project, I write up those findings, I publish them in a scientific publication. That publication goes to the library and it sits there on the shelf, although now, it's in a cloud form, maybe a little bit more accessible. And I try even harder, so I tweet about my findings, nice Twitter threads, and I create infographics and really try to get the findings out there. But I don't think that that's enough, because when these projects end, the intervention access ends, and people no longer have access to these great interventions that I developed, that many of the individuals in this room have developed. And so I feel like our big challenge and my recommendation is to try to figure out how to close this gap from these wonderful evidence-based interventions and how to get them with our policy colleagues and with our commerce colleagues and with our industry partners and with the healthcare professionals in the School of Medicine out there, so that our healthcare professionals aren't so overloaded and that they can give a referral to my iReach behavioral weight management intervention, which they currently can't. And so just as an example, today I got the notice of award for this new grant to further develop this iReach program. Thank you. And our whole point is to get this program out to rural communities that typically don't have access to digital weight management, because Medicare and Medicaid say there's not enough evidence to support their use. So we're trying to say, okay, you want the evidence, you have this on your website, we're gonna give you the evidence, but then at the end of the 5 years, how are we gonna call Medicaid and Medicare and say, we got these findings, it's time for you to start supporting this. And so I feel like that really is an example, just one example of how we can potentially take this great research that's happening all over grounds and make it more sustainable, make it more implemented throughout our communities and our healthcare system. Thank you.
All right, I'm Marc Breton. I'm working just upstairs at the Center for Diabetes Technology. and I'm representing the work that we do there. So in the center is a mix of engineer and clinical minded people, doctor, nurses. What we do is we develop and then test and validate technology to try to improve management of diabetes. And so we use digital technology in many, many different ways. We collect data, like most of you actually, through these digital technology, through apps, but we also actually transform digital technology into medical devices themselves. And we provide not only advice to patients, but dosing advice, and therefore are sort of crossing the Rubicon to FDA Class 3 medical devices. And so we have all kind of activities around what exactly does it mean to make a cell phone as dangerous as a pacemaker. And as Lee was mentioning, a lot of our work was around what's called the artificial pancreas, which is automated dosing of insulin, so a potentially deadly drug. And so we work on that aspect, on insulin pumps, and we control these insulin pumps with our apps, with digital technology. And so I think there's a particularly interesting line there where digital technology is not just a convenient way to communicate with people who we want to communicate with, but actually becomes part of medical device, part of the medical care itself. And my recommendation, bit tongue-in-cheek, but the biggest hurdle that we have in my world is that clinical data is everything. And that to obtain clinical data, pilot clinical data to foster new research, new lines of research, is incredibly difficult without a fairly heavy infrastructure, right? If you're just an engineer with a cool idea and you want to go test it, well, that's just not going to happen unless you have medical doctors, nurses, regulatory people, a whole village that is ready to support that particular work. And I have found difficulties early on, at least, to have such an infrastructure without a massive research operation. Now, thankfully, at the center, we do have, we're about 60 people now. We do have a sort of a critical mass, but even there, for young researchers, it can be very, very difficult for the first few years to get their project going. And I thought that could be an interesting way for the university to facilitate and accelerate research and make us even better at what we do.
Okay, so I am representing the across the lifespan component. My name's Jessie, and I do work in individuals with neurodegenerative movement disorders, so specifically Huntington's disease or Parkinson's disease. And what I've been working on most recently is working with my team and Bethany's team to develop a digital intervention to reduce anxiety in these populations. So as briefly as possible, when you hear Parkinson's disease, you probably think about the tremor, but actually anxiety is an enormous problem and really not adequately treated with current medications and other options that we have. So using digital technology not only to use another method to try to increase the mental health of these populations, but also in a more accessible way. And this actually does have implications for youth in the sense that nobody exists in a vacuum, and people are part of community and people are part of families. And so just something I was thinking about was that Huntington's disease actually it's called a prime of life disease. It tends to onset in earlier years when people often have young kids at home and are interacting with kids. And so listening to what everyone has been saying, have also been thinking about how in the populations that I work with, being able to leverage these digital technologies to improve their mental and social health would actually have implications for younger members of their family and the community. My recommendation is similar to Marc's, actually, which is that when I'm writing a grant, it would be so helpful if I could say, UVA has all these synergies, look at this centralized resource that UVA has as a place of excellence to develop and implement these digital technologies, for me specifically digital behavioral health technologies. And I was glad that you also mentioned young investigators, because something else that I was thinking of, sort of a added benefit, is that in terms of, a lot of people have good ideas, and when you're trying to get started, it's difficult. So if there is a place that's established that people know, I can go and bring this idea and connect with the right people to help bring it to life, that's helpful. And it's also helpful from the recruitment perspective for new faculty to bring new great people to our university. So thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with the next section that we're going to cover today, which is culture and civic life. I was saying to Ram, this could be an 8-hour event. It's fabulous to hear all of these ideas flowing and having everybody connecting. This is fantastic. And luckily, there will be many more opportunities to continue. We'll have another breakout session. We'll have the reception. But we do want to make sure to hit our third area and share some of the amazing work that's happening here and seed some of the questions for folks to discuss in this area. Ashley Wade is on the steering committee, but unfortunately had a conflict come up. So she has prepared her remarks by video. So she's going to get us started.
Good afternoon. My name is Ashley Wade, and I'm an assistant professor of media studies and African American studies. My research focuses on U.S.-based Black girls' digital practices, and this is my first year as a faculty member at UVA. The digital technology, youth, and development subtheme that we're going to focus on today, or in this group, is culture and civic life. In part, this subtheme comes from the broader grand challenge questions under the umbrella of digital technology and society. Among these questions are calls to address inequities in civic participation and to consider how living in an online world affects the creation of and experience of culture. Based on some of the preliminary research done by our committee, UVA has the potential to become a national leader in research and knowledge production in this area of digital technology, youth, and development, given how few centers across the country focus on this particular intersection. So even though we don't necessarily have centers or institutes at UVA that currently focus on this intersection, there is exciting work being done at UVA that does speak to the potential for us to become a leader and to grow in this area and to really set the standard for the research that's being done around digital technology, youth, and development. So in one of my own departments of media studies, for example, we have several faculty members who focus on digital technology at the intersections of civic life, economics, democracy, and culture, and we'll be expanding in these areas of expertise as we develop and grow our newly approved PhD program. Additionally, we are also hiring in media policy and an open area of media studies. And so we are confident that we can contribute to this area of grand challenges within our department, but also hopefully have a center or be able to develop a center and have our faculty members contribute to the work at that center. I've listed a few people on this slide who are doing work specific to digital technology and or culture and civic life, including myself. And you can, of course, look at our faculty profile, so I won't necessarily read through all of these names and all of our work, but this is just one example of work that's already being done on grounds that could potentially contribute to this field of digital technology, youth, and development. So in terms of thinking about where our strengths lie, the Media Studies Department faculty, of course, represent one area of strengths in this area. But we also need to think about ways that we can address current gaps. So I think that in order to make sure that UVA is a leader in this particular field is to make sure that we find a balance between different approaches to research. So for example, a balance between people who are working on humanities, social sciences, STEM, and the arts, as well as people who are taking qualitative and quantitative approaches to the development of this scholarship. So on that note, I will leave you with a couple of questions. What are opportunities for collaborations across grounds to bolster research in digital technology, youth, and development? And how might UVA distinguish itself in the field of digital technology, youth, and development? Thank you.
We also have now three wonderful short presentations from folks to introduce themselves and some of the really interesting work that we're doing. So Lenise Avery also unfortunately had a conflict arise, but has generously sent in a brief introduction. She's assistant professor of psychology and assistant professor in the Women, Gender, and Sexuality department.
Hi, my name is Lenise Avery, and I'm an assistant professor of psychology and women, gender, and sexuality studies here at UVA. I direct the research on intersectionality, sexuality, and empowerment lab, or the RISE lab for short, where I conduct research that explores the contributing role of digital media on identity development, sexual socialization, victimization, and mental health among Black women. Black women are among the largest consumer groups of mainstream and digital media in the United States. And while digital spaces provide an important context for community building, social connection, and positive identity formation, digital spaces may also be a toxic environment for Black women as they report disproportionate experiences of online race and gender-based harassment. They also report disproportionate experiences of sexual objectification and exposure to restrictive beauty and body standards. And these heightened experiences of digital victimization could be associated with poor mental health and well-being, but to date, little is known about whether heightened exposure to the racist, sexist, and heteronormative gender narratives derived from digital media actually undermines Black women's body image and self-esteem, which are key factors in youth development and mental health. My work in this area aims to help us better understand how digital and social media impacts Black women's self-concept, identity construction, relationship development, sexual subjectivity, in addition to their mental health outcomes. Understanding digital media's roles on Black women's health and development is complex. It takes rigorous methods to capture the nuance, social context, and the temporal conditions that shape Black women's paradoxical experiences with digital media. These sites offer young Black women an opportunity to produce and consume empowering messages, but they also heighten their exposure to gendered racism and sexual victimization in the process. So my findings showcase how digital media are not unilaterally associated with diminished health outcomes, which is a win, but more work is needed to figure out exactly how users can leverage the promotive components of digital technology to improve young folks' mental health and social well-being while mitigating the detrimental consequences that accompany heightened online victimization.
All right. All right, please join me in welcoming Chris Barrett, who is the director of the Biocomplexity Institute and Initiative. You can come up here, that's great. And Chris will be followed by Marc who is the inaugural director of the UVA Darden Data Science Collaboratory.
Hi, so I'm Chris Barrett, and so what is the Biocomplexity Institute? I'll just tell you quickly, because through that, we would really like to participate as much as we can and facilitate as much as we can with any of you, all of you. The issue here with the digital world and youth, I guess I would say something very self-evident maybe, but as the digital world rolls out, as the connected world rolls out, and the people that grow up in it, grow up in that context, their interactions are not the same as the interactions of those of us who grew up before it, and it isn't the same as the interactions that the people that are growing up in it will have, because they are participating in the evolution of that system. So the concept of who they are and how they interact with other people, in other words, their citizenship, their agency, is evolving in that way. I think we have to think of the problems in that complex way, is that who you are is now extended. It's who you are inside your shirt, combined with your enhanced sensing apparatus, perceptual apparatus, state assessment apparatus, decision-making apparatus. It's still you, though. You still have responsibility for it. So I'll just give a couple of examples of issues that I think, these are just darts at a very large dartboard. There's lots of other examples you can make. But if, there's social media sites associated with reputational information. Some of them are commercial sites, some of them are like LinkedIn, some of them are My Life, some of them are other ones. Who's responsible if the information is wrong? Are you responsible to pursue the fact that it's wrong? Are they responsible to fix it? Who's responsible? The law is pretty silent because it doesn't understand that that's actually part of you. You didn't authorize them to collect the data, and yet somehow you're responsible to maintain the integrity of the data, as far as I can tell. So these kinds of questions are redefinitions of agency itself and of individuals as citizens and other, just not as individuals, but individual agencies like corporations and other kinds of agencies that have these things. That's what's evolving as much as the technology, as much as anything else. The entire social contract is evolving. And the fact that the youth is involved in growing it is one thing, but considering that the technology itself is new and emerging, we're all children. We're all young and growing into and changing what this object is. And so we all, I guess, have a responsibility to help grow it. So I think this cross-sectional or intersectional research at the technical level, at the social level, at the psychological level, in economic level, that has to be viewed in an integrative way, in my opinion. And I think that across the university here at UVA, I think we are really well positioned to be able to do that. If there's any way that we can help you do that, we would like to do that. And I would just like to say, I already said this to Ram offline, but given that some of this issue really does come down to the evolution of the law itself, I really think that we should also take into consideration and possibly the evolution of the corporation itself. Maybe that's an issue of law as well, I'm not sure. But our professional schools might need to be involved in this evolution as well.
Thank you.
Okay, do we need the microphone, or, yes, we do need the microphone. Hi, everybody, I'm Marc Ruggiano. It's a pleasure to be here and to have this opportunity to meet so many new people and see so many new faces, so thank you for that. I represent the Darden Data Science Collaboratory, and I came to UVA only about 4 years ago. And so I made the transition to higher education after about 25 years in the corporate world and a handful of years prior to that flying airplanes in the U.S. Navy. And so I'm happy to be here at UVA, but I still sometimes walk and talk like a corporate person and not an academic person. And so if I use words that don't resonate 100% with you, please forgive me and point it out afterward if you would, because I'm working on that, I promise. The UVA Darden Data Science Collaboratory is a new academic center that was created a little over a year ago to advance efforts between those two schools and ultimately more widely across grounds at the intersection of data science and business. And one of the areas that the collaboratory is focused on is misinformation. And Bethany and the committee asked that I talk for a couple of minutes, no more than 2 actually, about that. And you know, the topic of misinformation has come up in every one of these sessions that I attended. And so, you know, there are many facets that people across grounds are interested in or already working on. And the two that are natural fits for the collaboratory are the technology perspective and the management perspective. And you know, UVA, as everyone else has said, has you know, tremendous thought leaders and wonderful activity in each of those areas already. The technical perspective is, you know, understanding how technology creates and or exacerbates the problems and challenges that we face with misinformation. An example of UVA work in that area is actually from a researcher on Chris's team at the Biocomplexity Institute. Parantapa Bhattacharya has a paper in preprint on deepfake text detection, which helps us understand how we can use some of the same tools that we blame for creating and disseminating misinformation to actually identify it and potentially do something about it. On the business side, the very business model that powers advertising today is one of the primary causes of the explosion of misinformation that happens, because we've created incentives for corporations, big media, big tech, to engage people. And to engage people, they need to figure out what will cause you to not leave. And there are other business models that we could and should be exploring that are much less susceptible and that produce much less harmful incentives to create and spread misinformation in the name of increasing engagement. Today, though, I want to highlight a different facet of it and recommend that you all think about how this may fit into the grand challenge things that come out of what we talk about today. And that is, can we tackle the challenge of enabling every UVA graduate to be a responsible and effective consumer and producer of information? Right? Those of you who've been in higher education for a long, long time have heard these conversations about civic engagement and other similar topics. But as part of what we're doing here, can we create the infrastructure? And it's probably not storage and compute, right? It's other forms of infrastructure to enable the wonderful instructors we have across grounds to have our students, our graduates, leave being responsible consumers and producers. And can we go beyond that and play a leadership role across the Commonwealth in helping other institutions, both higher education and potentially secondary education, to do the same thing, so that when students arrive here, they are more informed and more capable, and when they leave here, they are well equipped to be responsible citizens through the use of information and digital technology. That will take courage. If you've been following what's going on at Harvard Kennedy School, you will see some of the challenges and some of the dangers that are out there for an institution that decides to make this a priority. But the opportunity to be preeminent is substantial, and I ask that you consider how that might fit in the plans going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our Culture and Civic Life group. Now we're going to have one final speaker. So Stephen Johnson's going to come up from the steering committee and talk about some of the cross-cutting issues to tie together some of these pieces. And then we'll do one more breakout group before doing a wrap-up.
Thank you, Bethany. So I will be brief. As we do the next breakout, we're going to have kind of two different focus areas people can self-identify into. One being the one that we just heard about with culture and civic life. And then another is an opportunity to look at things that cut across lots of different dimensions of what we're doing in the relation to the grand challenges. So one of these, and I appreciated Lana Avery talking about specifically, was equity issues. And so this just really cuts across like everything that we're doing. One, in relation specifically to digital technology, is having access to the technology resources themselves. Right, so the idea of a digital divide has been around for a long time. That was primarily first came out in terms of just internet access. The idea of digital deserts, that's as we move more towards who has broadband, who has lower bandwidth. Right, that was really evident, if you might remember stories during the first COVID lockdown and virtual schools, and you heard about teachers and students having to go to the McDonald's parking lot in Southwest Virginia in order to get internet access, right? We have another era of divide coming up as well, which is a big equity issue, which is the data divide, which gets to, as we now move into AI and data-driven solutions. So one of the key things that's different about AI compared to other forms of digital technology, one is that it's just very scalable, but it's scalable based on identifying patterns and stereotypes in data. And so the data itself becomes really important, and underserved populations from digital in general also then tend to be underrepresented in the data that's used to then train AI interventions or any kind of AI solutions. So if you're not represented in the data, you're not going to be represented or served well by the technology. Inequities in benefits and harms, right? So we've heard some of those examples earlier today. So that's one form of cross-cutting, right? That equity is something that comes into play in all of these different areas. Another goes back to research and measurement. And there's been some ideas that have percolated across different discussions around the challenges for having comprehensive data acquisition for individual and cohorts, granular behavioral or attitudinal measures, things like sensors, apps. A number of folks I heard just talking about that at my table earlier. Something that's come up as well, longitudinal data design. Longitudinal, like I sometimes think of it, that just means like 1 month of daily data. In other cases, maybe it's granular data over a year or years. There's some very famous but also very kind of expensive studies that are more lifetime longitudinal. Any of those, whatever that amount of time is when you have the repeated measures, you start to get into a lot of complexity around what are the best analytical techniques for that. I mean, I think anybody that's kind of collected data about interventions starts to get into some thorny issues about the trade-offs and modeling decisions for those. And then finally, also want to invite people to think about connections. Many of us have attended more than one of these Grand Challenge events, or you may also see connections of your own work and back to the other Grand Challenge themes, right? So within, as Ram said this morning, earlier this afternoon, within digital technology and society, in addition to what we're looking at here with youth and development, there's also digital technology and democracy. That has some real connections back to youth in terms of things like we can think of education, we can think of civic life, smart communities, smart spaces, that direct connection back to culture, civic life, economic opportunities for youth and that impact youth. And then precision health for populations has some very direct connections back to mental and physical health, among other things. So that's just a brief invitation to think about, even bigger picture, what are the things that cut across all of these different three areas that we've been talking about.
Thank you.
Great.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Sure, no problem. Thank you so much. So what we're going to do now is do a final breakout group session for about 20 minutes, and then I'll do just a very rapid wrap-up so that people can then transition to enjoying the reception, and we can continue the conversation that way. I'm not going to try to get everybody all organized here like I did last time. My challenge to you is just find some new folks to talk to. So go to a breakout group with some people who you didn't talk to last time. I think people are talking across areas, which is fantastic. We just want to hear all the different ideas that you want to raise. It's the same link that you had before. And again, if you can make sure that there's a note taker in your group, we just want to get your ideas. I'm going to keep poking around across groups to just hear some of the important issues that you guys are all raising. So we'll take 20 minutes and then we'll gather back to wrap up. Thank you so much, everyone. Move to the reception and again get to continue this conversation. All right. Most of all, on behalf of the steering committee, we just want to say thank you. It's been so fun. I've been circulating among the different breakout groups and just hearing people's ideas, people's feedback. I've been scribbling madly here about things to kind of remember and take away from these conversations. And what's been particularly fun is all the, oh my gosh, me too, and I have this problem, and I'm in this totally other school or department or whatever, and then it kind of like primes the pump of like, oh, this is what we clearly need to work on because all of these folks are like hitting these similar challenges. I also want to express my thanks to Ram and to Megan for bringing the opportunity to all get together in the room because it is really, really fun. And again, to Cindy, Shelley, and Dolores who've just done a phenomenal job of bringing together these 4 events in a very short space of time. I hope that over the course of the afternoon, it has really hit home that this is just an exciting time, as I said before, to be having this conversation, both in terms of the work that is going on and the people that are working on this, and the number of sort of opportunities for synergy. And, a couple of people came up to me and said, I hope we'll have these kinds of events, whether or not there's a grand challenge, because I'm meeting all these people who are doing cool stuff. And I think some new collaborations are going to have started this afternoon. And that's just amazing to kind of have these connections happen. I would also just highlight that it's an exciting time and place, not just in terms of at UVA, but this is a huge part of the national conversation. So again, my area happens to be in mental health, so those are the sort of examples that come to mind for me. But many of you may have seen that just in 3 weeks ago, the White House put out their report tied to the State of the Union, and they put out 8 research priorities. This grand challenge theme is 2 of the 8. In terms of what the White House is saying is on the national agenda of what needs to be prioritized. And for me, that's exciting, not just because it points to the timeliness of this being like, this is something we need to tackle. It also points to those issues of sustainability, funding long-term, all of those kinds of things. This is an area that is primed for investment in a sustained way. And for me, that just makes it really exciting to think about what we can do. We're going to be busy, the steering committee, over the next few weeks of integrating all of this great feedback that you have given. Thank you to all those who entered it into the Google form. I know many of the steering committee members have been taking notes themselves in the groups as well, and I've been running around jotting feedback. There was a ton of just sort of great ideas raised. I'm not possibly going to summarize everything, but we will take time going through. I will just highlight a few key pieces before we break into the reception that for me just really stood out in terms of answers to these questions that were coming up in the conversation. One was just, in terms of the areas of expertise that we want to make sure that we're not missing. Issues of media literacy came up in a number of the conversations. Issues of implementation science came up and sort of needing to have real strengths in those places in order to be effective. And then really interesting question tied to the ethics and thinking about bioethicists and sort of their role in some of this work of how people get engaged with digital programs and what that means and the ways that getting involved is at the just at your fingertips, and that has a million advantages, but also brings with it risks and sort of all of those pieces that were coming up. So interesting conversations I heard about consent processes and crisis management and all kinds of things in this space. In terms of resources, lots of ideas were being raised, whether it was here today or from other folks who've come to done the surveys or come to our office hours or different things, but seed grants and bridge funds and funding for postdocs, funding for interdisciplinary collaboration. I also made a point of reaching out to students to hear what they hoped would come out of this initiative, to hear what they thought would foster their training in this area. And they talked about different kinds of student training opportunities, being able to get to workshops, to get the specialized training in different places, to be able to do practicum and internship and all kinds of things. And then, across these conversations, there's been lots of comments about some of the challenges that need to be managed. And some of those were in the kind of like content areas of, the disruptive potential of generative AI was mentioned in multiple groups as kind of a like, whoa, we got a lot to sort of tackle here and navigate. And other kinds of challenges were more about how we work effectively. So I heard a lot of interesting comments about the need to break down silos. And I think that points to the partnership piece here of us really needing to think about partnerships in broad ways. So there needs to be the ways for us across schools and departments to be partnering with one another. But also, if we want to address that critical issue that I think Becca centered so beautifully in her comments. I heard Wendy talk about it. Lots of folks raise these pipeline issues of how do we move kind of this exciting development work that's happening into the hands of people who actually need them. What are the policy changes that need to happen? What are the implementation science things that need to happen? How is it that we actually go from, hey, I've got this really cool X to this actually being used? And there was a lot of folks lamenting like things that had been developed at UVA, people at UVA couldn't even get access to. And that's clearly a problem that we need to really think about. And so what do we need to do a better job of using this as an opportunity to think about those pipeline issues? And so I'm excited to hear people's feedback and questions and ideas in that space. And then lots of things tied to infrastructure, right? So, connections also with funders, with government, with community. User-centered design came up in lots of spaces as, thinking about how we work. And then from an infrastructure standpoint, I heard people talking about data acquisition and curation needs to do mobile, capacity to do mobile sensing in really strong ways. And then this sort of sense of like, for folks who don't identify as someone with expertise in the technology side, but have this idea and want to partner, how do they sort of become part of a tech hub? How do they make those connections and feel like it's easier to have the entryways to do that kind of work? So those were some of the notes that I took. We were going to take a lot of time to go through all of the feedback that you've been giving us, because we really do appreciate it. We want to keep the conversation going both now over a glass of wine and what looks like really yummy food out there, which is fantastic. But also, the QR code is there. Please keep giving us your ideas. You saw the names of all the steering committee members. We're happy to talk with you. We're excited to get your input and to hopefully shape something that can be exciting for the community. So again, thank you to all for coming this afternoon and joining this conversation. We really appreciate it.